Hey everybody, Chris here. In this episode, we eventually make our way to Mount Arapiles in Australia for a really special moment in climbing history. Much of the climbing in Araps, including the route that we get into here, is currently in danger of closure without any input from climbers or the nearby town of Natimuc, whose economy and residents heavily depend on climbers. There's a link in the show notes for a great video on the issue, as well as a change.org petition that you can sign. Having spent a little time in Araps myself, I can tell you that it's worth the trip. Thanks. Let's get into it. In 1981, in the attic of a small terraced house in Sheffield, the center of the climbing community in the UK, Rab Carrington made the first sleeping bag to bear his name. More than 40 years later, the people at Rab are still crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment for the mountains, the kind of gear that becomes a staple in your kit that you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business and expand access to the outdoors. They're committed to preserving our mountain playgrounds for future generations because they know that the mountains are our meeting place. April 1984, 7 Mosselstrasse, Oberschallenbach, Germany. It seemed like the commotion in the house just kept going, no matter what. Everyone was aware that he was brooding. Maybe brooding isn't exactly the right word. He rarely showed that he was unhappy about these things. I mean, sure, there were occasions when someone would trespass on land that he considered ethically sacred, and that would certainly get a rise out of him. But usually, he would blow up briefly and be back to himself, the final word being some article that he'd write from his philosophical soapbox. But this time, they noticed that he wasn't drinking his coffee. And that meant trouble. It was getting cold in his hand, hovering just a few inches above the table, where it had already been for several minutes now, while he was staring off into nowhere. This is the same person who once remarked, "A man doesn't go to drink coffee after climbing. Coffee is an integral part of the climbing." And here he was, ignoring his now room temperature cup. Meanwhile, the kitchen was buzzing with activity. Kurt Albert was standing in the corner telling jokes between sips of his coffee. Norbert Sandner, who owned the house and lived upstairs, was in and out working on various things. A whole gaggle of climbers were preparing for the day. Ingrid was getting more and more frustrated by the people whose names she didn't even know who had taken over her kitchen. You know, normal day. But Wolfgang was absorbed in deep thought. On one hand, he really enjoyed Jerry and the way that Jerry approached climbing. He could see how much he loved climbing in all of its forms. And even though they'd only known each other a short time, he already knew they'd be close friends. On the other hand, that wiry little ball of power had just waltzed in last fall, done all of their hardest routes despite their attempts at sandbagging him, and then one-upped everyone by doing the first 8A plus, or 13C, on the planet. Right there, in their area. And then there was the issue of backer. And he sensed in himself a tension, like he needed to respond, and he wasn't sure how he felt about it. He wasn't competitive, or was he? Regardless, he couldn't ignore that he felt an urge to try harder. He finished his coffee hastily, forgetting this one time to savor that last drink, and pushed away from the table. There were climbs to finish, and there was training to be done, and he was sure that Jerry Moffat was home in Sheffield, already getting stronger. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
Wolfgang Güllich was feeling unsettled. Shortly after Jerry Moffat left the Frankenjura and his whirlwind takedown of pretty much everything, Wolfgang had to go to the States to work on a film. They'd hoped the film, Superclimb, would introduce more people to sport climbing, like Patrick Edlange's films had done in France. But it didn't take off quite how they expected, leading Wolfgang to take a harder look at how he was spending his time. He wanted more people to find the sport, sure, but he also didn't want these things to take his attention away from actually climbing. He had also recently taken on more responsibility by co-founding a company called Fire Rock Sport with Norbert Sandner and another friend. And this made them the first Boreal reps and distributors in Germany, at a time when the Boreal Fire was the most popular shoe on the market, worn by virtually every great climber. That really wasn't what he wanted to be doing either, but he felt like he needed to keep some sort of attachment to a more legitimate form of income. But the downtime from hard climbing projects did have the benefit of giving him time to consider and reconsider his motivations and philosophies around climbing, something he often put deep thought into. And it gave him more time to learn about training, which he viewed as absolutely necessary. And now, I know these two things can sometimes seem at odds, the philosophical view and one focused on performance. And I've come to realize that Wolfgang might have been ground zero for that conflict, at least in terms of the modern sport climbing era. Because he saw climbing as a sport just like all others, with nothing inherently transcendent about it, and he defended that position fiercely. Yet, almost in opposition to this view, he also cared deeply about the ethics and style of how a route got done, initially hanging on to the yo-yo style for much longer than other top climbers, and believing that the no-bolt ethic in places like the Sean Gunks of New York was simply better than what he considered to be over-bolting in his home area, while, of course, at the same time, espousing the benefits of sport climbing. Put simply, Wolfgang was complicated. He was human. And like I said, he was feeling unsettled. Maybe even a little competitive. And he'd been burned by this competitive spirit before. See, in 1981, John Backer, aka Johnny Rock, unanimously considered to be the best climber in the world at the time, was invited to Germany as a guest for a climbing meet. And while there, he was made very comfortable in Kurt and Ingrid's apartment. He swept through the Frankenjura, sending their hardest things and putting up the new hardest route in the area, Chasing the Train, a nod to John Coltrane, his favorite jazz musician, but also a jab at the international climbing scene in general. The US is the train. You all are chasing it. It didn't matter that Wolfgang actually beat Backer to the first red point. He admired the strict yo-yo ethic that Backer had employed to figure out the moves. And like many, he held Backer on a pedestal as a symbol of pure ethics. The next summer, overlooking this obvious jab, Wolfgang went to the US and briefly met up with Backer and Joshua Tree. John took him on a tour that included several of his top rope first ascents, including Equinox, which had recently been done on lead by Tony Yaniro. Wolfgang quickly did the second lead ascent. And it's possible that ate at John a little, because on the drive back to LA, he turned to Wolfgang and asked him not only for half of the gas money, but also for the amount that it would have cost for a train ticket. The audacity. Wolfgang, who was always generous, was taken aback, especially considering the hospitality that Backer had enjoyed in Germany. But he wasn't one for confrontation, so he simply decided that from then on, he would keep his distance from this competitive American, and instead, he'd let his actions speak for him. And so he went directly to the center of the climbing universe, Yosemite Valley, a place Backer presided over. He quickly repeated the two hardest routes, Cosmic Debris and the Phoenix. And he was out of the valley as quickly as he came in, and he then set his sights on the hardest route in the country at the time, Tony Yaniro's Grand Illusion at 13B. On July 1st, after 7 days of work, including experimenting with a practice that he wasn't quite settled with, hangdogging, Wolfgang completed the second ascent of the fabled route. He wrote in his diary, "Total fatigue, need to vomit, no appetite, can't sleep." And as would happen several times throughout his career, that flurry of furious activity resulting in a big send was followed by a period of lower motivation. This often corresponded with winter in Germany. He didn't much care for climbing in the cold. Instead, he would study, he'd train, he'd look for any improvement that might be had. But when the motivation started to ramp up again, he would make an escape. And in January of 1983, that escape was to the south of France, to Gunks, which was quickly becoming the most famous crag in the world. Situated above an old village in a hidden valley, the walls of Gunks would eventually be nicknamed the Laboratory because of its mad scientist developers who were creating what was essentially the first crag fully dedicated to cutting-edge sport climbing. At Gunks, Wolfgang flirted with a variety of styles and ethics, sometimes yo-yoing things, sometimes red-pointing them. Occasionally he'd hangdog, but even in his moments of transgression, he'd set limits. That winter, he made frequent trips to both Gunks and Verdun, reeling off route after route in what he'd later jokingly call his hunter-gatherer period. He'd do every hard route in an area before moving on, making these trips his most productive years of climbing in terms of sheer volume anyway, and building up a massive base of hard climbs that would serve him well in later years. Between trips to the south of France, during a visit from UK superstar Ron Fawcett, Wolfgang managed to make the second ascent of Kurt Albert's 1982 route Magnet, which was then the hardest route in Germany. Shortly after, in mid-May, the French Federation of Mountaineering organized an international gathering of climbers, the first of its kind in France, to take place in Verdun in the south and Sassois in the north. 34 invited climbers from 12 countries would attend, including Andy Pollitt from the UK, Kim Kerrigan and Louise Shepherd from Australia, Arnaud Kent from Belgium, and of course, all of the French stars would be there. Ed Langer, Droyer, Tribu, the Les Ménestrels. Ron and Wolfgang had both been invited, and so they drove together to the Verdun. Teamed up with Ron in a competition-style event, Wolfgang was able to tick off the 4 hardest routes in the area in short order. But as it tends to do, the atmosphere quickly became more competitive than he was comfortable with. He'd later say, "I don't want to be unfair to my French friends, but I had the impression that in those days, they hardly recognized the achievements of others." His use of the yo-yo style was questioned. Many of the French climbers deemed his ascents invalid. And being told that his performance didn't count, that was too much for him, and he rashly responded by making the first ascent of an unclimbed project called Mission Impossible. Ironically, this project was one of Patrick Edlanger's, and Edlanger was one of the few people to recognize and sympathize with Wolfgang's predicament.
Get challenged and react in a rash manner. Crack number 1 in his non-competitive armor.
When the meet moved north to Sassois, according to Wolfgang, it took a turn for the worse. Both Edlanger and Wolfgang would walk away feeling even more frustrated. Reportedly, with the hosts on one side and the guests on the other, successes were hardly celebrated, but failures were put in the spotlight. Edlanger would leave the crag after his failed onsite on the famous short and bouldery Schimpanzedrome, and the hosts would revel in the fact that Wolfgang had also failed to do the route. The whole thing left a taste in his mouth so sour that shortly after the event he would publish an article called Various Games or Self-Deceit in Sport Climbing. In it, he would write, "The function of the rope at the hardest level of difficulty is to prevent any physical injury, and it should not make things easier in any other way. As a result, it's mandatory to lower to the ground after every fall without inspecting the holds near where you fell, a process known as yo-yoing. This needs to be distinguished from the less acceptable tactic of practicing the move you fell on, or hang-dogging. And the worst style is surely previewing and practicing the route on a top rope before leading it. It's the same thing as admitting that basically you're not up to doing the route. Competitive crack number 2. When challenged, retreat to a moral stance. The whole debacle resulted in a strained relationship with French climbers until many years later, when he would become friends with not only Ed Langer, but Trabue, Didier Rabatou, and the Les Ménestrels as well. But for now, he felt cornered. He responded by sticking to his most harsh ethical takes, despite having used hangdogging on some of his own hardest routes. And that fall, rather than return to France, he went instead to the UK to visit Ron Fawcett and to play his hunter-gatherer game on the bouldery limestone and bold gritstone. It was on this trip that he met a young, wiry ball of power named Jerry Moffat. I've got a confession to make. I've been climbing for nearly 30 years, and until a year ago, I'd never bought a piece of technical outdoor clothing. Maybe a raincoat 15 years ago and a puffy or two, but otherwise, nothing. But as I got back into sport climbing to try and finish 105/13s by my 50th birthday, I discovered that the cold winter winds of Wyoming that seemed to pick up force across the face of the crag and concentrate right on me were just too much for my usual hoodies. So I went shopping. And it takes a real event to force me to go shopping. I came home with a mid-layer that I thought I'd be able to climb in, but also might keep me from freezing up there, and I quickly discovered that the Rab Ascender light hoodie was long enough to fit easily under my harness, slim and stretchy enough to feel like it wasn't there, and had a hood that fit snugly enough on my head and neck that the wind didn't get in, and I didn't even notice the zipper. Since then, there hasn't been a single crag day that it wasn't with me. Now, I'm looking for other Rab layers that might make my experience even better. The Modulus hoodie and the Cirrus Flex insulated jacket, to be precise. And like I said, it takes a real event to make me go shopping. Rab. The mountains are our meeting place. The following spring, 1984, Wolfgang sat in his kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and found himself feeling some tension about Jerry's route, the face. But he respected Jerry, and he secretly wondered if he was even ready for the route. I mean, if he had been, why didn't he do it first? It was right there in his home area, already bolted. Same with chasing the train. It was an open project that he probably could have done if he'd just tried. Growing frustrated, his mind went to that exchange with Backer. He wished he'd said something then, but he had this innate need to get along with people. He was really only confrontational when ethical lines that he held sacred had been crossed. He finished the coffee hastily, and he pushed away from the table. He knew what had to be done. He went straight to Backer's route, chasing the train, and put up a harder route just to the right. Satisfied with his efforts, he named it Hitchhike the Plane, essentially saying, "Your train is way too slow, and the only way to keep up now is to get on board this plane."
Competitive crack number 3. When challenged, responded kind.
And even though it had only been a few years since Backer was considered the best in the world, Wolfgang was right. In terms of pushing standards, the doors of the plane had closed, and the U.S. was still standing there on the tarmac. And Wolfgang Güllich was taking his place in the pilot's seat. And the view from up there would open his eyes. That June, he made a trip to the Elbsandstein, a historic East German crag held in high regard for their free climbing ethics. And in fact, they'd been focused on free climbing for the entirety of their history. No aid climbing allowed, and routes could only be put up on lead. Their rule book, however, did allow resting on the ring bolts. On this trip, while repeating all of their hardest routes, he noticed something peculiar. Sometimes, when a ring bolt had been placed at what would be the crux moves, it allowed the sequence to be broken up by resting on the bolt, interrupting the crux move with what amounted to aid. With his new 20,000-foot view, he was seeing the shortcomings everywhere. Returning home with all of the hardest routes in Germany under his belt but one, he took another look at Moffat's new high standard, the face. And almost to his surprise, he quickly made the second ascent. He was ecstatic to have repeated his friend's route, and he could have kept the train rolling by, maybe the jet flying, by doing more hard routes. But Wolfgang wasn't a maniacally obsessed climber who went from one hard project to the next, to the next, to the next, forever. He operated in short bursts of activity so intense that he needed downtime. And he'd satisfied that growing urge to climb the absolute hardest thing by actually climbing the hardest route in the world. And what he needed now was a break from that singular focus. He needed a change of scenery, maybe with a cafe to sit in and sip coffee while he watched people walk by. And so he booked a trip to America to see his friend Russ Clune in the Gunks. And even on this short 2-week trip, the usual slow starts that Wolfgang enjoyed were in full effect. Cafe, coffee, talk about where to climb, more coffee, flip through the guidebook. Okay, just one more cup. And eventually, around midday, he'd head to the crag. A few new hard routes had been done at the Gunks since his last visit in 1982. But since they were several levels below what he'd been climbing lately, he just planned for a casual hunter-gatherer trip. At the top of his list were the two contenders for the hardest route in the area, and hardest in the eastern half of the country, Intruders and Vandals. A bit of an anomaly for Gunks climbing, Intruders is an endurance route, long, steep, and juggy. It went down first on October 9th in just a couple of tries. Wolfgang felt it deserved 512 plus and famously remarked about the route, "It would have been hard if it had any hard moves." A few days later, on October 12th, he did Vandals. For this one, he had to work a little harder, believing it to be 513 and helping to solidify it as the first on that side of the country. He was in rare form, climbing better than ever. Refreshed and recharged by the adventurous style of climbing in the Gunks and spending time with good friends, Wolfgang returned home looking forward and immediately departed for the southern Frankenjura. He knew of a project in the Altmetall that might be next level. It was on the Kasselwand, the tallest wall in the area, that in the late 70s had seen Kurt Albert open two of the area's early, bold 511s. Flipper Feets, the same climber who had shown the face to Jerry Moffat, had shown this project to Wolfgang, and as usual, he'd done all of the moves, but had no interest in the send. Ranging from slabby to slightly overhanging and back again, and more slippery and smooth than the main Frankenjura, the climbing was 513 just to get to the hardest move, after which was still in the upper 512s. If he could get that strange high step and huge lock-off to the mono dialed in, he was sure he could do it. And he was sure it would sit somewhere near the upper end of the scale. After a couple of days of fiercely intense, focused sessions, he was getting close. And he'd become positive that it would be not only near the upper end of the scale, but above it. A new grade entirely, possibly the first solid grade 10 or 8B. Having recently done the face, not to mention a whole slew of 8As in France, he was in the perfect position to make that call. On October 24th, the day of his 24th birthday, he managed to make it to the crux feeling fresh. He put full trust in those terrible feet, pulling himself so close to the wall that he could feel its coolness on his cheek. He scooched up slightly, and then a little more. He tightened everything and reached. Just as he was about to begin tipping back off the wall, his finger found that elusive pocket. One more hard move, and he was on a jug, easier climbing above him. And as the top section was protectable with gear, he hadn't added any bolts. Fresh off his trip to the Gunks, it only seemed right. And it was the best birthday gift that he could give himself. His first time establishing an entirely new grade, the first 13D or 8B in the world, Canal I'm Broken. He celebrated simply by making the most of the good momentum that he had and finishing a few other hard routes. But the winter soon came. Once again, as the daylight hours and temperatures dropped, so did his motivation to climb. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest, the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And they also make, right here in the USA, a whole suite of premium training and performance goods. And you can get many of those for 15% off if you use the code WRITTEN15. Tension Climbing. Mastery over success. At the beginning of March 1985, Wolfgang Güllich boarded a flight to Melbourne. It was still freezing in Germany, and he was getting restless. Nearing the end of the 25-hour flight, he tried making small talk with the woman next to him, telling her that he's coming to Australia to go climbing. She finds it hysterical. "There are no mountains in Australia," she tells him. He pulls out the guidebook and points to Mount Arapiles. "That's just a hill in the desert," she exclaims, cackling now. He has to laugh too, but at the same time, he's not exactly sure what to expect. He's hoping that at least when he gets off the plane that it'll be warmer than when he boarded. Good climbing will just be a bonus. When the plane lands and he walks out into the warm air, the top climber in Australia, Kim Kerrigan, is there waiting. Wolfgang climbs into the car and is almost immediately asleep, woozily in and out for the next 4 hours of nothing but flat land. And they roll into the tiny town of Natimuck, and still a little off-kilter from the massive trip, Wolfgang stumbles into the house. But he's immediately at home. It has the same community feel as his place, and his friends are already there. His good friend and photographer Heinz Zach is there with his family. Swiss climber Martin Schiel is there obsessing over a project, and several other climbers he knows have made the place their temporary home. And they've all been here for months already and are unanimous in the one thing they have to say about the climbing. Arapiles is the best climbing in the world. Rising sharply out of miles of farmland, the bubbly smooth orange quartzite cliffs of Arapiles look like they were purposely shaped for climbing. Heinz leads the way to a steep orange and gray route on immaculate stone. "Let's start on anxiety neurosis. It's a 26, he says to the perplexed Wolfgang. Whatever that means, Wolfgang thinks to himself, shrugging his shoulders. My fitness is not so good after a winter of not climbing, but sure, why not? As he racks up, Martin Schiel explains the grade system, starting from the top. 30? That's the mystical top level here. The hard routes are incredible. India and Ethiopia are both 29, and Masada is that 30. You must do those. Trying to listen but fighting hard on the steepest part of anxiety neurosis, Wolfgang falls off. I suppose I'll need to figure out how to climb 26 first. And of course, he would. Wolfgang's original plan was to embark on one of his hunter-gatherer missions and do the 10 hardest routes in the area. And as he was gaining fitness and learning the ways of the rock, he made quick work of those 3 hardest routes that Martin suggested: India, Ethiopia, and Masada. Having a look around one afternoon, he stumbled upon a line of bolts up an incredible wall. It was that project that Martin Scheel had been working on and was unable to finish before he had to leave. And he'd left it open for future climbers to finish. And Martin had already named it Punks in the Gym. In the book High Life, Wolfgang writes, "My desire grew to the point of obsession to try this route. In fact, I'd never seen a sport climbing goal of comparable beauty before. To climb the only possible line at the limit of current standards straight up the middle of a freestanding tower has to be the epitome of the sporting ideal of free climbing. Such a special situation awakens the highest motivation. It concentrates all energy on just one goal." That hunter-gatherer mission would have to wait. Wolfgang laced up his Borealfie rays and slowly made his way out the unprotected ramp to the start of the climbing, marveling at the quality of the stone and the creamsicle colors, a bright orange flake sitting on a creamy white wall. A long series of sloping baby-bottom side pulls, underclings, and smeary, slippery feet led to the first of 2 cruxes, a big reach to a strange pinch feature that required him to stay sucked into the wall long enough to readjust the pinch into a Gaston and get stood up to a jug side pull. A short traverse left leads to a good rest, and finally into an even harder sequence, a big move to a left-hand Gaston way above his head, an opposing right-hand Gaston elevator door style, followed by traversing back right to a horribly sloping right-hand side pull, and then a big move to a good in cut that he'd match, known now as the bird bath. More than one future climber would make it here, let their guard down, and fall on the next devious sequence. A long move up and left, walk the left foot up to a hidden foot, marked by big tick marks even back then in 1985, hand-foot match on the bird bath, get rocked up, then it's a quick shake and a breath before heading up the technical, still very easy to slip off of, finish. And now let me step out of the story for a second and explain something. When Martin Scheel was first trying the route, he had finally sorted out the big move to what he called an ear of rock, only to have it snap off on one of his many attempts. In his estimation, the route would be impossible without it. So he created a new hold, a practice not unheard of at the time. The 4-finger, 1-pad end cut that he crafted was the hold Wolfgang would try the route with. And eventually, this hold would be nicknamed the bird bath. Years later, Andy Pollitt, after 60-some attempts, would snap that hold off, and many iterations of the bird bath, glued back on, would follow. Now, I have to assume that Wolfgang knew the hold was manufactured, an ethic he had railed against in the past. Maybe he figured, well, it's already done, or it's possible he was simply blinded by the beauty of the route and didn't even notice. And pinning down the style used to work the route has been even more difficult. I've seen reports saying Wolfgang spent several days top roping the route despite his disdain for top rope rehearsal. Some people who were there say it was worked in yo-yo style, which may explain the top rope reports because, as far as I can tell, particularly when one person is working on the route, top roping and yo-yoing are very close cousins. And what's most unclear is if he again allowed himself the transgression of hangdogging. Having climbed on the route myself, I just can't imagine not hangdogging to sort out the intricate body positions. But I'm not Wolfgang, and I suppose that was his entire point. He wanted that challenge. But what it all comes down to is that in a time of evolving ethics and rapidly advancing difficulty, Wolfgang simply loved climbing hard routes so much that his ethics were never quite immutable. This is, of course, in contrast to the occasional moral stance that he would strike, usually when challenged in some way. He was seemingly totally willing to adjust his ethics when it suited the advancement of the sport, or at the least, he was willing to adjust his ethics for his own advancement first, which, frankly, seems to be the way it usually goes. I mean, he was, after all, at the cutting edge of a sport that was rapidly growing and changing around him. If he hadn't allowed his ethical stances to be malleable, he very well may have been stuck in the past, like so many other climbers. But this route seemed like the future. He was sure it would be next level. Just getting to the rest below the hardest sequence felt like an 8A by itself, and it might be 8B from there to the top. He wrote about the route. Combining the extreme bouldering passages into a single movement complex seemed completely hopeless at first. The economical factor in the movement and the increasingly precise, fluid, and concentrated application of modern climbing coordination are the key to success. Translated, this thing is really hard. To get up it, you're going to have to climb it really well. After trying for a few days, Wolfgang grew certain that it would be grade 32 on the Australian Eubank scale, 2 grades harder than anything at Arapiles and a grade harder than he'd ever climbed, which would make it the hardest route in the world at 8B plus or 14A. And regardless of the ethical and stylistic path to get there, top roping, hang dogging, yo-yoing, or whatever, on April 9th, 1985, Wolfgang Güllich tied in under the route one last time. He felt confident that he'd sorted out the nuances of how to shift his weight from one smeary foot to another and from one creamsicle side pull to the next. He had dialed in the first crux and the short traverse left to the rest, and there he could get it back and prepare mentally. And while he'd figured out the big move to the Gaston, the short traverse back right, using and reusing the same holds for new moves, he knew it was going to test him. But if there's one thing Wolfgang excelled at, he could execute. And so he left the rest and made the big reach to the elevator doors. He reached out right to that tiny seam on that slippery sloper. Took a deep breath, set his feet, he looked up, and laser focused on the end cut. With no hesitation, he pushed off of the terrible footholds, launching himself upward. Just before he fell away, at that precise moment of weightlessness, he snatched it, reeling it in and quickly matching hands to make the big move up and left. His foot followed the tick marks to the blind smear. He matched his right toe next to his fingers, rocked over onto the bird bath, and Wolfgang Güllich stood up into history. Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Over the next couple of weeks for our patrons, I'll be reading a few of Wolfgang's essays on ethics and performance. You can join and hear those for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, especially tell that group of guys who are always standing around arguing about how low to downgrade that boulder they can't even do yet, and together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. This episode was a roller coaster ride. I knew I was going to take the angle of being competitive, even though that requires reading between the lines of everything written about Wolfgang. And it's actually easier to see his competitive side reading what he wrote as opposed to what people wrote about him. And I actually think that's an issue with researching historical figures, is that we tend to lionize people to the point of overlooking their less than desirable qualities. I'm not even going to call them faults, because I don't think they're faults. I personally don't even think it's a less than desirable quality, but a lot of people do. So it required some reading between the lines, some translating things, some going deep into magazines. And then once I was just about done with it, I realized I had to take the ethical angle, because there was so much confusion, even in Wolfgang's own records, about how things are done. And he made a point of recording things as red circle, which was yo-yo, red point, which we know now, on-site, first ascent, things like that. But there were question marks around punks in the gym. He did not make a distinction there. So it was hard to say, how did he do that? Some people said yo-yo. Some people said he top roped a bunch. Really hard to figure out, different reports in different places. And he first yo-yoed chasing the train, but then also red pointed it. So how many times were red points preceded by the yo-yo and not involving hangdogging? The ethics were such a jumble, like the styles of sending a climb, if we can use that as an umbrella term, were so confusing, which meant manufacturing a lot of the conundrums that he was dealing with. If I look at his writing, the way his writing and his responses in interviews changed over time indicate to me that he was sorting this out in his head throughout these years. But he doesn't write that down. He doesn't say it. You just have to look at all of these writings and go, okay, from this to this to this, he had shifted his thoughts on it. So there had to be some point in there where he was mulling this over. And I just feel like we have to look at these ethics and these styles, because they are what were helping to usher in all of this new difficulty and really causing climbing to speed up the way that it did, particularly in terms of difficulty. We often look back at this era, Wolfgang's era, of going from the face, Jerry's The Face, all the way to Punks in the Gym, and then Action Direct, which is 14A to 14D in just like 6 years. We look at that time as this time of advancing difficulty, but in reality, it was advancing styles and ethics that were allowing that difficulty, that rise in difficulty, to happen. So I don't think we can skip over that. And this just seemed like a really interesting place to do it, because Wolfgang is so lionized. But he wasn't this perfect person. And I just despise that view on things. None of us are perfect. So to hold up our heroes as if they never struggled with their own thoughts and ideas and intentions and ethics and styles, I'm not a fan of that. And that's what this became. Took way longer than I expected. Ended up being way longer than I expected. But I hope you enjoyed it. It was a tough one to get through. I didn't even say this. Shout out to Chase Bailey, our newest rock star. I appreciate your support. Coming up, because I have to start writing the next episode ASAP. I've only got a couple of weeks before it comes out. Coming up, I think we're going to add a week onto our celebration of Wolfgang. I have several conversations coming, 3 different conversations, as well as a bunch of bonus episodes that are readings of Wolfgang's writing, and then sort of talking through my thoughts on those and how they influenced this episode. So all that is coming the next couple of weeks. But first up, next week, we're talking with a major member in the community in the Frankenjura area who has worked with Kurt Albert. He's worked with Jerry Moffat. He's worked with Cafe Craft. I'm looking forward to you all hearing that conversation. And we also have our first return guest who was our most popular episode until just a few weeks ago. And you might be surprised by who was the most popular episode for over a year, coming back next week. Also, later this week, I will be wrapping up the Russ Clune, the Lifer giveaway. I'll announce those winners in the Patreon. I'll also shoot you emails, and you'll hear about it here in the Secret Stoners Club. All right, I got to go start writing. See you guys.